Okay, so let's start out by talking about fiscal policy and what it is. So, the discretionary changing of government expenditures or taxes in order to achieve national economic goals, such as high employment or opposite side of the same coin, low unemployment. Another goal might be price stability, so keeping inflation low or avoiding deflation. As well as another goal of economic growth. Okay, so discretionary, by the way, just means the government has a choice in changing those things. It's at their discretion, right? There are some things in the federal budget that are non-discretionary. The government doesn't really have a choice in changing those things without some major overhauls to tax law and spending law. Okay, so very simply put, we know that part of GDP is government expenditures. So an increase in government spending will stimulate economic activity. And these can be changes in things like military spending, education spending, or budgets for the various government agencies that exist, like the FBI, the Department of Housing, the Food and Drug Administration, etc. Okay, so recall our Keynesian model with its long-run aggregate supply and short-run aggregate supply curves. And here we see, right here, we're starting in a recessionary gap. Okay, so the economy is in a recession, and what can the government do to get us out of recession? Well, it can simply just boost spending. Similarly or equivalently, it can actually reduce taxes as well, but that has more of an effect on consumption. But both of those things act to increase aggregate demand to try to push us back to our long-run equilibrium and out of recession. Similarly, although this happens less frequently, if the economy is kind of overheating and producing above long-run equilibrium, the government can come in and reduce what it's spending or increase taxes to reduce consumption and get us back to long-run equilibrium. But that actually doesn't happen very frequently because it's not politically popular. So it's very common for the government to do things to get us out of recession, but when we're kind of overheating, it usually doesn't take any action. But it could theoretically, and this is what it would look like. All right, so let's think about this. Would the increase in government spending have to equal the size of the gap, right? So here the gap, let's go to the recession here. The recessionary gap here is $500 billion or $500 billion. Would the government have to spend $500 billion to get us out of the recession? That's the question that we're asking here. And then another question to ask is, what impact would expansionary fiscal policy have on the price level? Okay, so that's what we're talking about. Expansionary fiscal policy is fiscal policy that increases aggregate demand, and it helps to expand output and real GDP. And like I mentioned, rather than changing its spending, another way the government can stimulate the economy is by changing taxes. And so this has an effect basically on consumption, right? So if it increases taxes, it causes a reduction in aggregate demand because it reduces consumption spending. It can also reduce investment expenditures and as well have an impact on net exports. All right, so here is our expansionary policy picture again. Basically, we're in a recessionary gap here, and it could, rather than spend more money, it could reduce taxes to increase consumption, investment, and net exports to get us back to long-run equilibrium. And if we're sort of overheating, right, it could increase taxes to push down aggregate demand. All right, here's another question that we're going to want to answer through the course of this chapter. What would be the long-run impact of a tax cut on real GDP if the economy is already at full employment equilibrium? So we're going to answer these questions that we've seen in this section here. throughout the course of the chapter.